The brand on his arm melted right into his skin. 80 became 41, then 18, then 6. Then his wrist was as empty as a corpse's, and 10,000 people gasped because for them, this was worse than death. In Chongran, a person without a brand is not a person. He is not even an animal. He is a blank space, and a blank space is sent to the scaffold. The numbers on your wrist in this country are more important than your name. They're called chrono reserves. You're worth as many units of time as you have. You'll live out whatever time has been allotted to you. A king is born with tens of thousands, a beggar with a couple hundred. And when Chanhyun was born, 80 were burning. 80, 10. The third prince branded a beggar. They laughed at him from the cradle. 80 in silk. The prince scum. The one whom even the guards didn't deem worth beating with full force. Why waste energy on someone who's already empty? And now those 80 were melting away before everyone's eyes, and melting away wrong, too fast. The Black Lotus of 7 breaths doesn't just kill, it burns the chrono reserve. It sears time right out of the blood. Someone slipped it into the ritual bowl during the ceremony. Someone knew the exact dosage. Someone had calculated everything years before this day. And this is where the most terrifying part begins. Hain looks up and sees who it is. Standing at the foot of the scaffold is So Yuri, his fiancée, the third Chrono clan. 1,200 units on a slender wrist. The girl he was promised when they were both 10. A dragonfly hairpin glimmers in her hair. A dragonfly. Silver wings. He carved them himself at 14, when his fingers still trembled with inexperience and the chisel slipped 3 times into blood. He gave her the dragonfly in her father's garden while they drank milk tea, and she laughed and said she would wear it forever. She didn't lie. She wore it all these years, at every ball, when she kissed him before bed, when she sat beside him and listened to his plans for their future together, when she was planning his death. Yuri adjusts the hairpin, lazily, with 2 fingers, as if she were standing not at her fiancé's execution, but at a boring reception. Not a single tear, not a single shadow on her face. And that's when Hain realizes, she didn't betray him today, she betrayed him every day, for years. Ever since that first milk tea. Walking beside her is Lim Gyong-soo, captain of the Royal Guard, 950 men, the man who pulled him out of fights, the man who once shielded him from a knife while hunting. Best friend. Was his best friend. Gyong-soo unfurls the scroll and reads the charges in an even voice. Too steady, without a stutter, without a pause. He had rehearsed. He had stood before a mirror and spoken the words that would send his friend to the block. Conspiracy against the crown. Connection to the silent era. Falsification of resonance. 3 charges, 3 hammer blows to the coffin lid. Hain doesn't listen to the words. He's heard enough lies in his life to recognize them by taste. He looks at Yuri, and she catches his gaze, and she leans in, and whispers so softly that in the deathly silence of the square, only he can hear. 80. I would have given birth to nothing but trash from you, just as empty as you. And I have always been curious. How long will you believe me before you understand? The word trash cuts deeper into him than poison, deeper than the Black Lotus, deeper than the ropes digging into his wrists, because poison burns the body. But this word burns everything that came before the body. Every cup of milk tea, every kiss, every night when he thought that at least one person in this world saw in him not a number, but himself. It's all a lie. It's all a show for a fool, branded a beggar. Cain clenches his teeth so hard, his enamel crunches. 7 figures stand frozen on the balcony above the square. White masks, white robes. Not a crease, not a movement. The Kronerhot. 7 shadows who rule over Chunryun's time behind the king's back. They decide who will receive the crown and who will lose their head. They decide how many units to add to a clan and how many to take away. They are the true power, and they never show their faces. It was they who declared Hain an anomaly threatening the flow. It is their seal that stands at the bottom of the sentence. They sanctioned the execution and called it a service to the world, as if cutting out an 80-year-old is an act of mercy, as if erasing an empty space is a favor to everyone else. Hain looks at the 7 masks and for the first time all day feels not fear, curiosity. What are you so afraid of? What is it about me that made you gather 10,000 people just to make sure I'm dead? The executioner steps forward, huge. The 2-handed axe in his hands looks like a toy. His face is blank, no malice, no pity. For him, it's a job. Today a prince, tomorrow a thief. The day after tomorrow, whoever they say. He raises the axe and the sun catches the blade so that the steel turns white for a second. 10,000 people lean forward. No one wants to see this. No one can look away. Hain isn't looking at the axe. He's looking at the dragonfly in the trader's hair, at the silver wings he carved as a boy, believing that love exists. And inside him, something grows very still. Not anger. He's already moved past anger. Not pain. The pain remained with the poison. Silence. That absolute silence that comes when the very last thing that kept a person human breaks inside. And in that silence, Hain thinks a single thought. Cold. Steady. Like the bottom of a well in winter. He will not beg. He will not scream. He gives them 1,000 years to enjoy that smile. To each of them, Yuri, Kyung-soo, the 7 in masks, the father who signed the paper without batting an eye. And then he will return and take that smile along with their faces. The axe comes down. The blade traces half an arc, a quarter of a second until the neck. And in that gap between the swing and death, something opens up in Hain's chest that he never had. What the doctors couldn't detect, what Kronerhat had been sniffing out for years and called an anomaly. Not magic, not Riance, not Chrono Reserve. 0. Absolute 0. And this is not a void born of weakness, not a lack of power. It is a hole, a real hole in the very fabric of the stream. That place where time simply stops flowing and the world stands still. The axe freezes in midair, mid-swing. Light solidifies on the blade like a cold crust. A drop of sweat on the executioner's forehead hangs like a glass bead and does not fall. 10,000 faces turn to stone mid-breath. Yuri freezes with that very smile at the corner of his lips. Gyeongsu with his scroll rolled up. The Kingfather with his hand on the scepter. The 7 on the balcony in white masks are frozen just as they were. A bird hovers over the square with its wings spread wide, not flapping them. The flags do not flutter. Smoke rises in a column above the braziers. Time has stopped entirely. The whole world, except for one. Hain is alive, and Hain is alone. He falls forward, face first onto the planks of the scaffold, because the poison is still burning him from within. Time is frozen all around him, yet there is no black lotus in his blood. His body is falling apart. His chrono reserve is at 0. Every breath feels like his last, but he is alive, and he is crawling. His palms cling to the planks, and the planks are real, rough, warm from the sun that no longer moves. The air is real, the pain is real, and the world is silent. No wind, No sound, not a single movement except his own. He crawls past the executioner's frozen legs, massive as columns, past the frozen axe above the spot where his neck had just been, past a glassy drop of sweat. Every centimeter feels like a kilometer. His hands are shaking, his vision darkens. But he crawls because to stop means to give up, and he cannot give up. Not now, not to them. He rolls over the edge of the scaffold and collapses onto the cold stones of the square. Yuri's body stands 3 steps away, so close. He reaches out to her. His fingers reach the hem of her dress and pass through the fabric like through steam. He tries again. And again his hand passes right through. He cannot touch the frozen world. He is inside time, and they are outside it. He can only watch. And he watches. From below, looking up. From the stones. At the silver dragonfly in her hair. At his work. At his own foolishness. At the proof that he believed. The traitor lies at the feet of his betrayer and commits this view to memory down to the last detail. The dragonfly. The smile. The axe over empty space. He memorizes everything. Because now he has something no one else in this world has. Time. As much time as he wants. And he will remember this view for 1,000 years. And when time starts moving again, and the axe finishes its path, cleaving the void where there will no longer be a neck, he will take the first breath of a new life and begin to count. Debts, faces, years, every single one. Hain lay at Yuri's feet for 3 days, maybe 5, maybe a week. There was no time, literally. The poison was burning his mana core, and every breath felt like a sip of boiling water. He counted his breaths because there was nothing else left to count. 1,000 breaths. 2,000. At 3,000, he lost feeling in his left arm. At 5,000, his right. Shadow resonance hovered at 0. His body was dying. Slowly, but surely. The Black Lotus of 7 breaths was designed for instant execution, but stasis stretched the agony into infinity. The traitor crawled. Every day he crawled. Away from the square, away from the scaffold, away from Yuri's frozen smile. He moved through the streets of the capital, and the city was a dead painting. A merchant on the corner held an apple to his mouth. A boy ran after a dog, and both his feet left the ground. The guard at the gate froze during the changing of the guard. Hain crawled between them like a worm between statues. His knees rubbed raw against the cobblestones. His fingers left bloody streaks that wouldn't dry because even evaporation had stopped. He knew where to crawl. To the palace. To Yuri's chambers. She kept books there. Many books. Among them were grimoires stolen from the palace library. Cain knew this because he had brought them to her himself, at her request. She said she liked to read before bed. He believed her. Idiot! He crawled for 3 subjective months. The streets of the capital, the palace bridge, the gates, the garden, the corridors. It took him 2 weeks to make it up the stairs to the 2nd floor. Every step was a feat. Every ascent was a battle with a body that wanted to die. Yuri's room smelled of lavender. The scent had frozen along with everything else. Silk gloves lay on the table. Calligraphic brushes. A stack of letters. And books. 7 cabinets. Hain pulled himself up to the first one. His hands wouldn't obey him. He banged his forehead against the door and it opened. Books spilled onto the floor. He read while lying down. He turned the pages with his teeth when his fingers failed him. The first 100 books were useless. Poetry, treatises on fashion, letters from admirers. Yuri had kept them all. In the 101st book, he found what he was looking for, the Grimoire of the Inner Flow, stolen from the 4th Chrono Clan. Not combat magic, medicine. A method for cleansing the mana core of toxins by redirecting residual resonance. Hain read it 3 times, every word, every diagram. Then he began to practice. The first attempt nearly killed him. The residual resonance in his core was pitiful. Not even a unit, hundredths of a unit. He directed everything he had at the point of poisoning, and the pain was so intense that he bit his tongue until it bled. The second attempt went slightly better. The poison retreated by a millimeter. He repeated the process day after day, month after month. After 6 subjective months, he was able to stand on his own 2 feet. The shadow resonance showed 3 TR, 3 units, a pitiful 3 units. A commoner with a 0.1 HR mark was more dangerous than that. But Hain was standing. For the first time in 6 months, he was standing on his own 2 feet in the room of the woman who had killed him. He looked at her table, at the letters. He picked one up. Gyeongsu's handwriting, dated 2 years earlier. Lim Gyeongsu wrote to So Yuri that he had obtained the vials, that the prince's blood was safely stored, that the absorption ritual could be performed after the execution, that her resonance would rise to 1,800 HP. 2 years. They had been planning this for 2 years. Every dinner, every walk, every goodnight kiss, everything had been mapped out. Hain put the letter back in its place, straight, neatly. Not a single detail in this room must be moved. When the time comes, Yuri must not know that anyone was here. He found 4 more grimoires in a hiding place behind the wall. Yuri had hidden them behind a mahogany panel. He discovered the hiding place by accident when he leaned against the wall and heard the emptiness. The 2nd clan's combat alchemy. The 6th clan's body fortification technique. The basics of anchor binding. A forbidden treatise on the nature of chrono-resonance. 4 books. Each was worth more than a life. Hain read. He practiced. He fell. He got back up. After a year of subjective time, his shadow resonance reached 60 TR. The poison had completely left his body. His mana core had recovered and begun to grow. He had mastered the 6 basic schools of Chongryon magic using the books he'd stolen from Yuri. She herself had placed the weapon in his hands. The thought brought something resembling a smile to his face, his first in a year. Hain stood in the trader's room and gazed out the window at the frozen capital. Thousands of rooftops, palace spires, the scarlet silk square in the distance. Somewhere out there, the axe still hung in the air. Somewhere out there, Yuri was still smiling. After 25 years of subjective time, his shadow resonance had reached 1,500 TR. He had surpassed Yuri, surpassed Gyeongsu, surpassed every Knight of the Wall and every commander of the guard. He had trained in the throne room, in the barracks, in the libraries. The entire frozen world was his training ground. Objects obeyed him. Books opened. Doors broke. Only the living were ghosts. He could not touch a single person, not strike, not embrace, or kill. At the age of 25, he went beyond the walls of the capital. To the south, beyond the mountain range, stood ruins. Strange ruins. Stone that did not exist in any treatise. Inscriptions that moved when he looked at them. A threshold. A massive threshold of black glass. Hain stepped toward it, and the let him pass. The Silent Age. A world that existed before time became linear. A world in which there was no flow, no chronorkit, no brands. The ruins were alive. Not in the usual sense. They remembered. The walls held voices. The floors held shadows. The ceilings held the dreams of those who lived here. The beings of the Silent Era knew no linear time. For them, a second and eternity were one and the same. Hain found the first grimoire on an altar in the middle of a hall the size of a city. A book made of a material that was not paper, not leather, not stone. He opened it, and his shadow resonance jumped by 800 points in a single breath. 1,500 became 2,300, just from reading the first page. The grimoire did not teach magic, it taught perception. The beings of the Silent Age saw reality differently than the people of Chong-Rian. Their magic began with the premise that linear time was a lie. Hain closed the book. He looked at his hands. His hands were no longer trembling. He returned to the threshold and sat down. Hundreds of years lay ahead. Dozens of grimoires lay ahead. A power lay ahead that Kronar Hat didn't even suspect. But first, he would return for 10 seconds to check that the world was still standing, to check that Yuri was still smiling, to check that the promise was still alive. 100 years, 100 subjective years of solitude. Hain snapped his fingers and the world trembled. Colors returned. Sounds returned. The wind hit his face. 10 seconds of real time. He stood in an alley 3 blocks from Scarlet Silk Square. Shadow resonance 8,000 TR. Emperor Chong-Rian's official resonance 12,000 HP. Hain was already 2/3 of the way to that number, and there was very little left to go. He stepped out of the alley. The street was alive. People were walking. Merchants were shouting. A dog barked at a boy who finally landed and ran on. The world hadn't noticed 1,000 years. For him, a quarter of a second had passed. The axe had already fallen. The square was already buzzing. Hain heard screams from there. Something had gone wrong with the executioner's plan. The blade struck empty planks. The condemned man had vanished. Hain walked down the street in the torn shirt of a condemned man and barefoot. No one recognized him. The third prince was a skinny boy with the mark 80. The man walking along the pavement looked different. 100 years of training had reshaped his body. His muscles were dense and lean, like the roots of an old tree. His movements were economical. His eyes were calm to the point of emptiness. He looked 30, though inside he was 119. A patrol came round the corner. 4 guards. The Lim Yong-su crest on their breastplates. The one in front spotted the condemned man's shirt and grabbed his sword. The condemned man had escaped the scaffold. Alarm. Yong-su had been expecting this. He knew something would go wrong with the anomaly. He had stationed patrols at every intersection. 4 blades, 4 pairs of eyes. The eldest among them had 400 HP, a serious fighter. Hain stopped. He didn't slow down. He didn't take a fighting stance. He simply stopped walking. The senior guard swung from the shoulder. A good strike. Fast. 400 HP poured into the blade. Steel capable of cleaving through a stone wall. The sword struck Hain in the shoulder, and the sound was like a hammer striking a bell. The blade shattered. Shards of steel hung in the air for a second and rained down onto the pavement like broken glass. The guard stared at the shard of the hilt. His hand was trembling. The 3 behind him didn't move. Hain didn't flinch. There wasn't a scratch on his shoulder. Not even his shirt was torn. Footsteps. Heavy, fast. Lim Yong-su burst around the corner in person. 950 HP. Captain of the Royal Guard. A sword in his right hand. The resonance pulsed around him as a visible aura. Silvery. Dense. He saw Hain, and his face twitched for a moment. He recognized him. He slashed without warning, 950 HP in a single strike. The air burst. The pavement beneath their feet cracked. The blade traced an arc and met Hain's neck. A clang, deafening, like the explosion of a glass mountain. The Royal Guard captain's sword shattered against the skin of the fugitive suicide bomber. Shards flew into the walls of the houses. One lodged itself in a doorframe. Another sliced off a sign. Young-Soo stood with an empty hilt, staring at Hain. Hain stared at Young-Soo. For 100 years, he had seen that face frozen in time. For 100 years, he had passed him in the square and could not touch him. Now he could. Hain raised his left hand, slowly. The sleeve of his shirt slid down to his elbow, his wrist, the brand. Kyung-Soo looked, and his pupils dilated. The brand showed no number. 2 black lines. Just 2 lines. The system couldn't display a value. At that moment, something happened in the capital that hadn't happened in 300 years. The altar of verification standing in the central temple cracked. A stone slab 7 meters high, a sacred device that measured the resonance of every resident of Chongryon. The crack ran from top to bottom, and a pillar of white flame shot out of it. The priests at the altar screamed. They sensed an anomaly. Something beyond the scale had appeared in the city, and the altar could not withstand it. In the red silk square, Archmage Di Choi Do-hyun stood on the balcony next to the chronarch. He watched the chaos below. The crowd was screaming. The executioner spread his arms. The scaffold was empty. And suddenly, Do-hyun turned his head, not toward the square, toward the city. He was the only person in Chongyun capable of seeing the true aura. Not the brand, not the number, the very fabric of resonance surrounding a living being. He looked toward the alley 3 blocks away, and in 3 seconds, his face went from boredom to bewilderment, and from bewilderment to horror. Pure physical horror. This isn't resonance. This is the negation of resonance. His legs buckled. The Archmage of the court, with a resonance of 4,800 HP, a man who had seen the auras of kings and elders. He lost consciousness while standing. His body slammed into the balcony railing and slid onto the marble. The 7 on the balcony didn't flinch, but one of them did. The second from the left. His fingers clenched beneath his white sleeve. He sensed it. Jung-Soo was still standing in the alley. His legs were buckling, not from a blow. Hain hadn't struck him even once. Pressure. Pure pressure of presence. 8,000 TR against 950 HP. The difference was like that between an ocean and a glass of water. Jung-Soo dropped to one knee, then to both. His mouth opened, but no words came out. One of the guards behind him, the younger one, whispered a number. He was trying to guess by eye based on the distortion of space around Hain. The air was trembling. The stones beneath Hain's feet were covered in frost, even though it was a summer day. The guard whispered, 40,000. Hain looked at him. For the first time in 100 years, someone had tried to measure him. The boy was off by a few times, but the attempt itself was amusing. Hain smirked, with just his lips. He leaned toward Jung-Soo. Jung-Soo was on his knees, and his 950 horsepower couldn't lift his body off the pavement. Hain spoke softly. He asked if Kyung-Soo remembered what was written in the scroll. A conspiracy against the crown. A connection to the silent era. Falsification of resonance. 3 charges. Hain said the first was a lie. The second would become the truth. And the third had always been true. Just not in that way. He hadn't forged the resonance. It had been forged for him. Kyung-Soo didn't answer. He couldn't. His tongue wouldn't obey him. 10 seconds were running out. Hain straightened up. He looked at the sky. Blue. Ordinary. A peaceful sky over the capital, which in a second would forget he had been here. He snapped his fingers. The world stood still. Again. Kyung-Soo froze on his knees. The guards froze with their mouths agape. The boy froze with a number on his lips. Silence. Hain stood over his former friend who was kneeling and looked down at him. This is how Kyung-soo would remain for the next 900 years, on his knees, in silence, his face full of terror. Hain turned and walked back, toward the ruins, to the silent age, to the grimoires that awaited him in halls the size of cities. 900 years lay ahead, enough to become something this world had never seen before. Yuri.
Kyung-soo, he reminded himself. The promise lives on, 1,000 years of patience. 900 remained, the 201st year. Hain stood before the second grimoire of the Silent Age, and the grimoire would not yield. The book lay on an altar of black glass, in a hall larger than any palace of Chongyun. The ceiling was lost in the darkness. The walls whispered in a language that had not existed for 1,000 years. The first grimoire opened easily because Hain knew nothing. An empty vessel. The Silent Age loved empty vessels. The second grimoire demanded something else. It demanded that the reader renounce his own perception of time. Neither slow it down nor speed it up. Renounce it. To cease feeling the difference between a second and a century. Hain spent 30 years before this altar. 30 subjective years sitting on the black glass floor. Meditation. Renouncing the habit of counting moments. The human brain clings to sequence. First this, then that, then the next. The beings of the Silent Age did not know this order. For them, everything happened simultaneously, and everything had already happened, and nothing was beginning.
In the 30th year, the book opened. His shadow resonance jumped from 15,000 to 17,500 TR in a single breath. His muscles cramped. His bones hummed. Every cell in his body reorganized itself to fit the new perception. He saw differently now. Not better, broader. The stone before him was not just a stone. It was every version of himself. A young rock, old dust, molten magma, all at once. And Hain could choose which version to see, which version to make real. This was the foundation of what would later become anchor magic. But that was still 600 years away. In his 300th year, he reached 45,000 TR and mastered the third Grim. This one was combat-oriented. If the first taught him to see and the second to feel, then the third taught him to act. The destruction of anchors. Every Chrono clan possessed an anchor artifact, an object binding the clan to the stream of eternity, the source of their strength, the source of their power, the source of everything. The third grimoire explained that anchors were not ancient relics. They were locks, fragments of a prison that someone had built a very long time ago. Hain read, and something inside him responded.
A dull rumble in his chest. Familiar, ancient, not a memory, something deeper than memory. He didn't try to figure it out, not now. Right now, he was learning to break anchors with his bare hands. The third grimoire provided the technique. Touch the anchor artifact. Find the thread of the stream within it. Break it, simply, elegantly, deadly for the clan whose anchor was destroyed. Without an anchor, the clan loses its genetic connection to the stream. The resonance of every clan member drops by half, forever. In the year 320, he emerged from the ruins and walked through the frozen capital. Just a walk, his first in 2 centuries. The streets were the same. Nothing had changed. Nothing could have changed. He entered the central temple. The altar of verification stood with the crack left over from his first emergence into real time 100 years ago. A stone slab, 7 meters, a crack running from top to bottom. The priest froze before it with his hands raised. Panic was frozen on his face. Hain approached the altar. He placed his palm on the stone, and the altar crumbled, silently, like a sandcastle. A 7-meter slab that had stood for millennia turned to dust under the palm of a man with 45,000 horsepower. Hain looked at the mound of gray sand at his feet and thought. It had been the primary instrument of control, the brand, the number, the rank, the place in the hierarchy. A person with 50 XP bows to a person with 500 XP. A person with 500 bows to a person with 5,000. And everyone bows to the chronarchate because the chronarchate controls the altar, controls the numbers, controls fear. When time runs out and the altar turns to sand, chaos will begin. The brand on Hain's wrist showed 2 lines. The system couldn't measure him even at 8,000. Now, at 45,000, it simply wouldn't notice him, just as an ant doesn't notice the horizon. Hain went further, into the palace's underground chambers, long corridors, chambers, storage rooms, and libraries. The ancestral libraries of the Chrono clans, which had been kept beneath the palace according to a tradition dating back to the founding of Chongryon. Each clan had its own room, its own castle, its own secrets. The locks did not stop him. At 45,000 TR, locks made of any material felt like paper. He entered every room, read every scroll, every book, every record, genealogies, secret techniques, political intrigues, 3 centuries of denunciations, 5 centuries of murders. He learned that the 4th clan had poisoned the 7th 40 years ago, that the 1st clan was selling information to the Huaguk Empire through envoys, that the 3rd clan, Yuri's clan, had been planning a coup long before Hain's execution. Yuri was neither a pawn nor an adventuress. She was the heir to a strategy her father had been building for 20 years. Hain, the wedding, the crown, the execution, blood for the absorption ritual. Every step had been calculated. He was a cog in the machine, a cog in the 3rd clan's clockwork. And Gyeonsu, too. The captain of the guard had been recruited while still a cadet. Yuri had chosen him personally, first as a tool, then as a lover. Order was important. Hain closed the 3rd clan's archives and sat down on the dungeon floor. Darkness, silence, a frozen world. He closed his eyes and saw Yuri's face. A smile, a dragonfly hairpin, silver wings. His fingers clenched into fists, not out of anger. The anger had burned out decades ago. Out of precision. Every detail fell into place. Every act of tenderness turned out to be a calculation. Every warm word was a move in a game he didn't even know he was playing. He opened his eyes, stood up, went deeper into the dungeons. Below the libraries were cells, real cells, not for criminals, for those who needed to be forgotten. Dark niches behind iron doors, empty, all empty, except for one. At the very end of the corridor, behind a door with 7 seals bearing the symbols of Kronerhat, stood a crystal, as tall as 2 men. Inside the crystal was a woman, old, very old. Her face like tree bark, her hair white to the point of transparency. Her hands were folded across her chest. Her eyes were closed. Hain had read about her in one of the grimoires of the Silent Age. Ha-Gyeonok, the last priestess of the world that existed before the flow. Kronerhat had sealed her 400 years ago. She knew something they feared. Hain placed his palm on the crystal, cold. The crystal was held in place by Kronerhat's 7 seals, and each of them was fed by the flow. His current strength would be enough to break 3, maybe 4, not 7, not yet 7. He withdrew his hand. He memorized the place. He memorized the face. 700 years from now, he would return here. She would wait. She had waited 400 years. She would wait some more. Hain left the dungeons and headed back toward the ruins of the Silent Age. 6 more grimoires lay ahead. 600 years still lay ahead. The promise was alive. He thought about it every day. Yuri, Kyungsu, Kroner hat. Faces. Names. Each would get what was theirs. Each would answer. Not with a scream, not with fury, with silence, with calm, like a stone at the bottom of the sea. The 600th year. Hain sat in the hall of the fourth grimoire and breathed. He simply breathed. Shadow Resonance 180,000 TR, a figure beyond comparison. Emperor Chonryun 12,000 HR. Court Archmage 4,800 HP. The entire Kroner hat combined was a drop in his ocean. The fourth grimoire lay open on his lap. It taught neither strength nor perception. It taught memory. The memory of things. Every object remembers everyone who has touched it. A stone remembers the mason's hand. A sword remembers the blacksmith's hand. A door remembers everyone who has entered it. The fourth grimoire granted access to this memory.
Hain could now touch a wall and see the centuries of its existence. Every touch, every voice nearby, every glance. He returned to the palace's dungeons, not to the priestess, to the archives. But now he didn't need to read the books. He touched the shelves and saw the hands of those who had placed them there. He touched the walls and heard the conversations that had taken place in these rooms for centuries. He reached Kroner hat's chamber, the lowest level, behind a door with 12 seals. He broke them all. At 180,000 TR, Kroner hat's seals felt like a spider web. Inside was a table. On the table lay a diary, an ordinary leather-bound diary. Hain touched the cover and saw the writer's hand. An old hand, long fingers, the white fabric of a sleeve. Mask. One of the 7 elders. He opened the diary. The handwriting was small and precise. The entries had no dates because for the elders, time was a tool, not a constraint. He read, page after page, and on the 37th page, he found a name. His mother's name. Jong Hae-won, the king's wife, first heiress of the 11th clan, 6,200 HR. Officially, she died in childbirth. Hain grew up with that story. His mother died giving him life. His father burned her portrait when Hain was 12. Tradition, he said. Memory should live in the heart, not on canvas. A lie. The elder's diary explained everything. Hae-won didn't die. She understood. She gave birth to a child with 0 HP, and instead of handing him over to the Chronerkit, she began asking questions. Dangerous questions. Why did the child without resonance survive? Why didn't the flow touch him? Why did the elders appear so quickly in the delivery room? She wrote letters. She searched the archives. She found a mention of the Silent Age. She found the name Ha-gyunok. The Chronerkit took her a month before she got to the truth. They didn't kill her. Murdering the king's wife would have raised questions. They imprisoned her, somewhere in the temple's dungeons, alive, for 19 years. Hain sat on the floor of the Chronerkit cell and kept a diary. His hands didn't tremble. His face was calm. 1,000 years of silence had taught him that. But something inside, something in the very depths of that place where even 180,000 TR was just a number, something cracked there. Mother was alive, all this time. When father was burning the portrait, when Yuri whispered the word trash, when the axe was coming down on her neck, mother was alive, in the darkness, alone. He stood up. The diary lay on the table. He remembered every word, every letter. The name of the elder who kept the diary wasn't mentioned directly, but the handwriting, the long fingers,
the habit of putting a period after every paragraph. Details. Hain remembered the details. He would come back to this. Right now, he needed to get to the temple. The temple's underground chambers were different. Not stone, living material. The walls pulsed. They were part of the flow system, part of the prison. Hain walked through the corridors and felt the flow wash over him, without touching him, without making contact. He was a hole in the fabric of the world, water flowing around stone. He descended lower, below the archives, below the cells, below everything marked on the palace maps. 5 levels, 10 levels, 20. On the 23rd level was a dead end, a wall made of a material that Hain had never seen, not even in the Silent Age. Solid, absolute, impervious to light, sound, or power. He placed his palm on the wall.
The fourth grimoire, the memory of things. The wall remembered. He saw 7 figures in white masks. They had stood here long ago, very long ago, long before the current elders, the first ones, the originals, the architects of the prison. They had placed something behind this wall, something alive, something that breathed, something that had no name. Hain withdrew his hand. He could not pass through this wall, not now, perhaps not at any TR level. It was not magic, not a power. It was the foundation, the bedrock upon which the entire stream of eternity stood. Behind this wall was a prison, a real prison, not a metaphor, not a concept, a cell. He turned and walked back, upstairs, toward the temple, toward the other corridors. Mother was somewhere here, not behind the wall, closer. He had been searching for 3 subjective years, touching the walls, reading the memory of the stones, following handprints, footprints, the echoes of voices imprinted in the stonework. In the 3rd year, he found it, a cell on the 14th level, small, 3 steps long, 2 wide, behind a door bearing the Kronerhat seals. There were 3 seals. He broke them in passing, opened the door. She was standing against the wall, frozen like the whole world, arms at her sides, eyes open, staring at the wall. Thin, very thin, dark hair with early gray, a brand on her wrist 6,200 hours. Chon Hae-won, his mother. 19 years in a 3x2 cell. Ha-in stood in the doorway and looked at her. She was alive, frozen, but alive. He couldn't touch her. His hand would have passed right through her, like through steam, like through Yuri in the square 600 years ago. He stood there, a minute, an hour, a day. Time didn't matter. The world stood still. She stood still. He stood still. Finally, he spoke. Not to her. She couldn't hear him. To himself. He said he had found her, that she would wait a little longer, that when time moved on, he would come for her, and no door would ever close between them again. Then he turned and left. He closed the door. Carefully. Just as it was. Not a single detail must change. Kronerhat must not know that anyone was here. Hain stepped out of the temple and looked up at the frozen sky. Blue. Peaceful. Deceptive. The promise was renewed. Yuri. Gyeongsu. Kronerhat. And now something else. Mother. His living mother in a cell on the 14th level. Every victory brought him closer to her. Every clan destroyed. Every name erased. Every step upward was a step toward the door behind which she waited, not knowing what awaited her. He headed toward the silent era, toward the 5th grimoire, 400 years ahead. He would spend them all, until the very last day, until the very last hour, and then he would return, and this world would regret not having killed him when it could. The 702nd year. The crystal cracked. Hain stood before him, his palm pressed against the surface for the 3rd month now, without removing it, without moving.
3 months of unrelenting pressure. Shadow resonance 320,000 TR. The 7 seals of the Kronar hat on the crystal resisted. The first burst in the second week, the second in the 5th. The 3rd and 4th broke together after 2 months. The 5th held out the longest. The 6th broke silently. The 7th burned with white fire and seared his palm. Not shadow resonance, the true flow, a defense set up by beings who were the measure. Kronar hat had put a part of himself into this crystal, a part of his ancient power, and that part did not want to leave. Hain stood there, his palm burned, his skin blackened and regenerated, cycle after cycle. The pain was familiar. Over 700 years, he had grown accustomed to pain. It had become a backdrop, like silence, like loneliness. The 7th seal burst in the 3rd month. The crystal cracked from base to top. The light inside flickered, went out, flared up again, and the crystal shattered. The shards hung in the air because time had stopped and even gravity operated through the stream. The old woman fell forward, frozen, like a statue. Hain held out his hands, and the shards of crystal, not living flesh, fell into his palms. Hagyonok's body hung in the air. She was alive, but frozen, like the entire world. He could not touch her, but the crystal was gone. When time resumed, she would wake up. 400 years of imprisonment would end the moment Hain snapped his fingers. He looked at her face, old, etched with wrinkles like bark, the last priestess of a world without the flow, the last one who remembered what came before the prison. The Kronar hat feared her memory more than her power. Hain sat down beside her. He couldn't wait. He couldn't speak to her either, but he could prepare. Around the cell, he laid out 7 objects from the Silent Age. Each bore the imprint of the era she remembered. When she woke up, the first thing she would see would not be a prison, but a home. Fragments of a home. Hain stood up and left. He spent the next 50 years in the deepest ruins of the Silent Age. The 5th grimoire, the 6th, each gave him a leap forward. The 5th taught him to sense the anchors from a distance, not to see, to feel, like a blind man feels the warmth of a fire. The anchors of the 12 chrono clans pulsed in the frozen world like 12 hearts. He could point the way to each one with his eyes closed. The 6th grimoire was different. It did not grant power, it granted knowledge. The history of the Silent Age. Not the one told by the Chronarchs, the true one. The world before the flood was not chaos. It was a different order. The beings who lived in it were not monsters. They were a civilization. They built, they created, they thought. Their magic was based on the principle that time is not a river, but an ocean. You can swim in any direction. You can dive, you can surface, you can stand still. Then the 7 came, the architects. They decided that the ocean was dangerous, that the freedom of time threatened something. What exactly? The grimoire did not explain. But they herded the ocean into a channel. They made a river out of the ocean, the flow of eternity, linear time, the past, the present, the future. One direction, one current, no deviations. Those who resisted were erased. The civilization of the Silent Age was erased. The ruins remained because they could not be destroyed. They existed outside of linear time. For them, the past and the future were one and the same. You cannot destroy what has always been. Hain read, and the rumbling in his chest grew louder. He knew what it was. A fragment. A partial reincarnation of the one who was imprisoned in the prison's foundation. That nameless being behind the wall on the 23rd level of the temple's dungeons. He was not a descendant. He was not an heir. He was a fragment of the one the prison held. And that is why the prison left him alone. Water does not fill a hole. The 800th year. 500,000 TR. Hain stood in the center of the largest hall of the Silent Era.
The hall was the size of the capital of Chongryon. The ceiling was the sky, not a painting of the sky, the sky.
the real sky of an era that no longer existed. The stars in this sky burned in patterns unknown to astronomy. They burned forever, even when the world stood still. The silent era did not submit to Hein's stasis. It existed in parallel. He trained here, every day, every hour, rehearsing technique after technique, combat forms of beings who knew no linear time, strikes that arrived before they began, defense that worked before the attack, magic that existed simultaneously in the past and the future. The Nameless One argued with him, Hein's shadow, his own shadow, which had gained a personality during 400 years of solitude. The Nameless One appeared only in stasis, only when Hein was alone. At first it was a whisper, then a voice, then a silhouette, then a face. Hein's face, but younger, 19 years old, just as he had been on the scaffold. The Nameless One said that revenge was pointless, that 1,000 years spent on a promise of retribution were 1,000 years spent on Yuri and Kyung-soo, that they weren't worth a single day. Hein listened. He didn't argue.
The Nameless One was a part of him. Doubt. The humanity that years of solitude had tried to erase. Hain listened and continued to train. Yuri, Kyung-soo, Kronerhat, his mother in the cell. The promise was not revenge. The promise was order. The world is built on lies. The stream is a prison. Resonance is a tax. The brand is a collar. The Chronarchs are the jailers, and every person in Chunryon pays with their life to keep the bars standing. To destroy this order, starting with those who betrayed him personally. This is not revenge. This is consistency. The Nameless One laughed. He said that Hain was lying to himself, that beneath 1,000 years of calm, there still stood a 19-year-old boy on his knees at Yuri's feet. And that boy wants blood. Hain did not answer. In the 850th year, he returned to his mother's room. The 14th level of the temple, a 3x2 cell. She was standing by the wall, the same posture, the same open eyes, the same gaze fixed on the wall. 19 years of real time. For her, 19 years had passed since the day she was imprisoned. For Hain, 850 had passed. He stood in the doorway and looked at her, memorizing. Again. The outline of her face, the line of her chin, her hands, long fingers, his fingers. He had inherited her hands. He said quietly that it would be soon, that in 150 years he would come, that the door would open and never close again. She didn't hear him. He knew. But he spoke anyway, because after 850 years of solitude, even a stone at the bottom of the sea sometimes wants to be heard. The 901st year. Hain opened the 7th grimoire, the last one. It lay not on the altar, but on the floor, fused into the black glass of the hall. Hain found it only because by the 900th year, his perception had changed so much that he saw things that did not exist in linear time. The grimoire existed simultaneously at every point in the hall. It was everywhere and nowhere. Hain pieced it together. Each part was a battle in itself, not against an enemy, against his own understanding of reality. The 7th grimoire taught anchor magic, not the destruction of anchors, creation, alteration, rewriting. An anchor is an object's connection to the flow of eternity. Every person, everyone, every drop of water is bound to the flow. Time flows through them because the anchor holds. Anchor magic allowed one to rewrite this connection, to strengthen it, to weaken it, to sever it, or to create a new one, where there is no anchor. Practical applications forced Hain to stop and simply think for several years. He could erase a living person from time, not kill them, erase. The person remained alive, but the stream ceased to see them. The mark faded. The resonance was reset to 0.
The body continued to exist, but the world no longer registered their presence. Not the altar, not the magicians, not the stream itself. A person became a ghost in their own life. Hain recalled Yuri's words, an 80. She could only bear trash from him. Resetting the resonance was worse than death in Chongryon. A person without a mark is not a person. They are a void. Yuri knew this better than anyone. She had built her entire life on numbers, on ranks, on the hierarchy of power. To take her number was to take everything from her. Shadow resonance at 900 years, 700,000 TR. The scale lost its meaning. The difference between 700,000 and the Emperor's 12,000 was like the difference between the sun and a candle. Not quantitative, qualitative. Hain trained in anchor magic on objects from the Silent Age. A stone from which the anchor had been removed ceased to age, not because it was strong, because time no longer saw it. A stone with a reinforced anchor aged in a minute. It crumbled to dust. Time passed through it at the speed of millennia. Precision. Anchor magic demanded precision. It was possible not to erase the anchor, but to rewrite it, change the parameters, make it so that a person's resonance would decline slowly, day by day, number by number. He himself would feel his strength draining away and be unable to stop it. Or the opposite. The resonance grows, but the body can't take it. The magic tears the vessels. The mana core cracks. The person becomes a bomb. Hain thought of Gyeonsu, the captain who always wanted more power. 950 HP. It was never enough for him. He trained every day. He envied everyone who stood above him. Give him what he wants. Give him so much that his body can't handle it. That would be poetic. The Nameless One said that Hain was becoming cruel.
Hain replied that he was becoming precise. The year 920. Hain returned to the capital, not to his mother, not to the ruins, to the hairpin. The dragonfly hairpin in Yuri's hair. The silver wings he had carved at the age of 14. He stood before the motionless Yuri on Scarlet Silk Square and looked at the dragonfly. 920 years had passed since the day he lay at her feet. He remembered the angle. From below, looking up. Now he was looking down from above. She was smiling. Still. A frozen smile, the corner of her lips. Hain raised his hand. Not toward her. She was a ghost. Toward the hairpin. The hairpin was an object. He could touch it. The silver was cold. He held the dragonfly and felt the fingerprints, his own. 14-year-old fingers, a file, a silver plate. 3 days of work, cut hands, crooked first attempts, and the finished dragonfly. A gift, the first gift. He saw her fingerprints too. Yuri put on the hairpin every morning. Every morning her fingers touched the silver. Every morning she looked in the mirror and adjusted the wings. And every time throughout the 5 years of their relationship, my heartbeat remained steady. Not once did it quicken at the sight of his gift. Not once. The fourth grimoire revealed everything. The object's memory did not lie. Hain carefully returned the hairpin to its place. Not a single hair must be out of place. Then he applied anchor magic, subtly, exactly. He hadn't rewritten the hairpin's anchor. He'd created a new one. He'd woven into the silver a link that would activate with a snap of his fingers. One snap and the hairpin would become a bridge. A bridge between Yuri and the void. Her resonance would pass through the hairpin and vanish into nothingness. It won't fall. It won't weaken. It will vanish. The dragonfly he gave her with love will take everything from her. Hain took a step back. He looked at Yuri, at her frozen face, at her smile. He said quietly that she was right. The 80s? Trash. But now the trash stands before her, and she can't even blink. He turned and walked away,
toward the ruins, toward the final years of training, toward the end of the millennium. In the year 950, he found a hall deep within the Silent Era that he had never seen before. A hall without walls, no ceiling, no floor. A space that existed on its own. In the center of this space, an object hung. Not an artifact, not a weapon, a shard. A piece of something that had been part of the creature behind the wall. Hain reached out, and the rumbling in his chest became deafening. The shard responded. Two fragments of a single whole. Two pieces of a single mosaic. Hain touched the shard, and the shadow resonance ceased to be displayed. It did not jump. It did not grow. It ceased to exist as a number. The scale ended. What he had become could not be measured by units invented by the jailers. He had become something for which there was no word in the language of Chongrion. The Nameless One was silent. For the first time in 500 years, even doubt fell silent before what had happened. Hain stood in the hall without walls and knew he was ready. The 1000th year. Hain stood in the scarlet silk square, frozen, silent, dead. The axe hung in the air. The blade stared at the empty planks. The executioner, Yun Cheol-su, froze in the striking position. Yuri stood below, Gyeongsu with a rolled-up scroll, the King Father on the balcony with his hand on the scepter, 7 in white masks, 10,000 faces, a bird above the square. Everything just as it had been 1,000 years ago. Not a single detail had changed. Not even a second had passed for the world. Hain stood in the midst of this frozen moment and watched, for the last time. One last look at a world that didn't know it had changed. He wore the torn shirt of a condemned man, the very same one. He could have found clothes, armor, the emperor's robe. In 1,000 years, he could have dressed in anything, but he chose the shirt, that very one, with bloodstains, with holes from the ropes on his wrists. They must see him as they left him, and understand that it means nothing, that the rag on his shoulders does not define the one who stands in it. He walked across the square, past the frozen spectators, past the guards, past the merchants on the outskirts. He looked into their faces. For 1,000 years he had seen these faces, knew every wrinkle, every mole, every frozen emotion, fear, curiosity, indifference, boredom. 10,000 people had come to watch the third prince die, and most of them didn't care. He climbed onto the scaffold. He stood next to the executioner. Yun Cheol-su, 600 HP, a plain face, heavy hands, neither malice nor pleasure. Work. He had come to do his job. Hain looked at him for a long time. This man would be the first to see him after time began again. The first who would have to choose, the axe or loyalty. Hain knew what Cheol-su would choose. 1,000 years of observing the executioner's frozen face had given him insight. A crease had frozen in the corner of Cheol-su's mouth. Not disgust, doubt. The executioner was doubting. A second before the blow, he hesitated. Hain repositioned himself on the scaffold. He knew the exact spot. Knew where to stand to be behind Cheol-su the moment time began. Knew which step to take and where. 1,000 years of preparation for 10 seconds. He checked the hairpin. The dragonfly in Yuri's hair. The anchor was in place. Invisible. Imperceptible. Even Kronerhat wouldn't notice until it was too late. He checked again. The Elder's diary in the dungeons. Ha Gyeonok's crystal was shattered. His mother on the 14th level. The altar of verification was destroyed. Everything was in place. Everything was ready. The Nameless One spoke. For the first time in 50 years of silence, he asked if Hain was ready. Not for battle, not for revenge, for what would come after. 1,000 years in silence, and then peace. Noise, voices, people,
Life! Is he ready to live after 1,000 years of death?
Hain did not answer. He stood on the scaffold, his back to the executioner, facing the square. 10,000 frozen faces before him. Yuri below, Kyongsu beside him, the king on the balcony, the Kronerhot in white masks. He looked up at the sky. Blue. Peaceful. The last peaceful sky this world will ever see. He raised his hand. His fingers snapped together. A click. The world shuddered. Color surged back. Sound struck like a wave. Wind, smells, screams, life. The axe traced an arc and the blade struck the planks. Empty planks. The wood split. Cholsu staggered from the momentum and his hands trembled. He struck at nothing. The condemned man was gone. The square didn't have time to scream. 0.3 of a second had passed since the blow. Cholsu turned, slowly, and saw him. Hain was standing behind him, in the same shirt, with the same bloodstains, but without ropes, without a brand, without his knees on the planks. He stood, upright, calmly, like someone who has spent 1,000 years alone with silence and hasn't gone mad.
Cholsu looked him in the eyes, and the executioner, a simple man, 600 XP, who had executed 300 people in his lifetime and hadn't lost a single night's sleep over any of them. This executioner saw something in Hain's eyes that made his fingers unclench. The axe fell onto the planks of the scaffold. Cholsu dropped to one knee, not from pressure, not from fear, from understanding. He didn't know exactly what he had understood, but his body knew. The square was screaming. The crowd was pressing against the cordon. The guards were grabbing their swords. Hain took a single step. He stood at the edge of the scaffold. Yuri looked up from below. That same smile. It was still there. She hadn't realized it yet. 1/4 of a second passed for her. The condemned man vanished and reappeared elsewhere. Quick. Maybe the poison hadn't taken full effect. Maybe the 80 HP resonance was enough for a single burst. That's what she thought. Hain saw it in her eyes. Calculation. Even now, calculation. Gyansu was already moving. 950 horsepower invested in his legs. He leaped onto the scaffold in a single motion, sword in hand. The blade was heading for Hain's neck. For the second time in that second, someone was aiming for his neck. Hain didn't move. The sword struck his throat and the sound echoed across the square, metallic, clear, like a blow to a bell. The blade shattered. Shards of steel flew into the crowd. Gyeongsu stood with a fragment of the hilt and looked at his hand. His hand was trembling. It had trembled back then in the alley 100 years ago. He didn't remember. To him, it had been a second ago, but his body remembered. His muscles remembered the pain of the shattered blade. Hain looked at him, at the face he had seen frozen 900 years ago. 900 years on his knees in the alley. Gyansu didn't know that. To him, he was standing on his feet. He was strong. He was a captain. He was Yuri's lover. He was a victor. Hain spoke softly, just for Gyansu, that he had had a chance to stand. Now he would stand on his knees, this time not for 900 years, forever. Pressure crashed down on the square. Not a blow, not magic, a presence. The sheer weight of existence that had grown in silence for 1,000 years. The stones of the square cracked. The flags on the poles sagged like wet rags. The torches went out. The guard closest to the scaffold collapsed to his knees. Then the next row. Then the next. The wave spread out from the traitor in concentric circles, like a stone thrown into water. People were falling, not from pain, from the impossibility of standing next to something that did not fit within their perception.
The court archmage, Cho Do-hyun, was already lying on the balcony. He had lost consciousness when the pressure touched his gift. His ability to see the true aura had worked against him. He had tried to automatically gauge Hain, and his brain had shut down. A defense mechanism, like fainting from pain. Only the pain wasn't physical. It was the impossibility of the number. King Father John Hyung-ju stood. He was holding onto the balcony railing. 9,500 HP. He was strong. He was a king. And his hands were shaking. The scepter in his right hand trembled. A family artifact. 600 HP of its own power. The oldest relic of the John clan. The scepter trembled because the anchor inside it was resonating. Something in the square was so outside the system that the artifacts sensed a threat. The king looked at the scaffold, at the figure in the tattered shirt, at the face of the son he had sentenced to death. And the scepter fell from his hand. It struck the marble. It split. A family artifact. 6 centuries. 600 A.D. The marble beneath it cracked. It was the first sound the square had heard since time began. Not a scream, not the clang of a sword, the sound of a shattered scepter, the sound of broken power. Yuri stopped smiling. For the first time in all the time Hain had known her, she wasn't in control of her face. Her lips twitched, her eyes widened. Not out of fear. Yuri wasn't afraid. She was calculating. Jeong's sword had shattered. The stones of the square were cracking. The guards lay on the ground. Yuri was calculating, and the numbers didn't add up. 80 HP can't shatter steel. 80 HP can't generate enough pressure to break stone. Not even 800 can. Not even 8,000. She looked at Hain's wrist. Where the brand should have been, there were 2 black lines. Not a number, a sign that the numbers had ended. Yuri took a step back. The second involuntary gesture of the entire scene. The first was a smile that had faded. The second was a step back. Hain looked down at her from the scaffold. For 1,000 years, he had seen this pose the other way around. She on top, he below, at her feet, in the dust, with an empty wrist and poison in his blood. Now, it was the other way around. He spoke, quietly, only to her. He said she had spoken of trash, that only trash could be born of it. He agreed. That is why he would not kill her. Yuri didn't understand. Not yet. Hain raised his right hand, 2 fingers. He snapped. The dragonfly hairpin in Yuri's hair flashed white. Its silver wings shone so brightly that the people around them squinted. The anchor that Hain had woven in 920 years ago activated. A bridge between Yuri and the void. Her resonance surged through the hairpin like water through an open dam. 1,200 horsepower. Every unit was draining away. The brand on her wrist was changing before her eyes. 1,200, 900, 600, 300, 100. Yuri grabbed her wrist. She could feel it. The power was draining away, not slowly, in spurts, like blood from a wound. She yanked the hairpin from her hair. Too late! The anchor is already activated. The hairpin was no longer needed. The bridge was open. Yuri's connection to the stream had been rewritten. 100, 50, 20, 10, 5, 0. The brand went out. The skin on her wrist became clean, empty, smooth, like a corpse's. Like Hain's 1,000 years ago, when the poison erased his numbers. Yuri screamed. The scream tore from her throat without words, a pure animal sound. Not pain. Loss. Absolute loss. In Chongryeon, resonance is not just a number. It is a sensation. The connection to the stream is felt by every cell, like warmth, like breath. When the connection is severed, a person feels the world turning away from them. The current no longer flows through the body. Cold, emptiness, silence. Yuri fell to her knees, on the same stones, in the same square, in the same pose in which Hain had stood, the symmetry he had been building for 1,000 years. She held the hairpin in her hand, a silver dragonfly, his gift, her sentence. Gyonsu leaped, without a sword, with his bare hands. 950 HP poured into his fist. He aimed for Hain's face, a loyal dog. Yuri was screaming, and he lunged, without thinking, without counting. The steel shattered upon striking Hain. His fist was bound to shatter all the more. But Gyonsu wasn't counting. Yun Chol-su intercepted him. The executioner moved fast for a man with 600 HP.
The axe that a second ago was supposed to chop off Hain's head stood between Gyong-su and the scaffold, the handle pressed against the captain's chest. Chol-su didn't say a word. His face was plain and heavy as always, but his eyes had changed. He had made his choice. The executioner's axe now protected the very man he was supposed to execute. Kyung-su struck the shaft. 950 horsepower against 600. Chol-su was sent flying 3 steps back. His feet left furrows in the stone. He held his ground. Hain didn't turn around. He didn't need to. Chol-su would manage. He wouldn't win. 950 against 600 was too great a gap, but he would hold him off. For a second, for 2. That would be enough. Hain raised his hand, his left. A brand unfurled over the square, his true mark. 2 black lines, but not on his wrist, in the air, burning with black fire the size of a castle tower. 2 lines, nothing more. The system that measured the resonance of every person in Chongnyeon tried to display his number and couldn't. 2 lines instead of digits, infinity instead of a number. The square, already brought to its knees, pressed itself against the stones. 10,000 people, guards, merchants, aristocrats, everyone. Not from magic, from the weight. Hain's presence weighed down on everyone who bore the mark. The higher the resonance, the greater the pressure. Commoners with 0.1 RP felt a slight hum. Guards with 50 RP couldn't lift their heads. Knights with 200 to 300 RP lay face down on the stone. The Hwaguk Empire's ambassador, Lady Liang Shui, stood on the balcony next to where the Archmage lay. 3,100 HP. She was one of the strongest in her country. She gripped the railing with pale fingers and looked out at the square, at the man in the tattered shirt, at the brand in the sky. Her face was ashen. She was a diplomat. She had come to observe the execution and assess Chunryong's vulnerability for an invasion. The Hwaguk fleet was stationed off the coast. The army awaited the signal. She had seen enough. Liang Shui pulled an encryption tablet from her sleeve. Her hands were trembling. She wrote a single line. Withdraw the fleet. They were 1,000 years too late. She didn't know how right she was. On the Chronarch's balcony, something happened that had never happened in the entire history of the Order. All 7 rose from their chairs at the same time. 7 white masks. 7 white robes. 7 silhouettes that never moved in public. They sat. They observed. They deliberated. They did not stand. To stand meant to acknowledge that what was happening deserved a response, that the threat was real, that control was lost. They stood. Hain looked at them, across the entire square, from bottom to top, at the balcony, at the 7 white masks. He had seen them for 1,000 years, motionless, impassive, dead in their grandeur. Now they were standing, and Hain knew that behind the masks were faces that, for the first time in centuries, expressed something other than boredom. He spoke, loudly, to everyone.
His voice was steady, no shouting, no strain. 1,000 years of silence had robbed him of the ability to shout and given him in return a voice that the entire square heard from wall to wall without the slightest effort. His name is Hain. He is the third prince. He was dead for a single second and for 1,000 years. Cronercat, he is coming for them. The words fell on the square like stones in water. Ripples spread out. 10,000 people heard. 10,000 people will remember. The third prince, the 80, trash.
The one whose brand doesn't fit in the sky. Kyung-soo stood on the scaffold. Chol-soo stood before him, an axe poised above his head. Blood trickled from the executioner's split lip. 950 against 600. The difference spoke for itself. But Chol-soo stood. Kyung-soo looked past him at Yuri, at her knees, at her empty wrist, at the hairpin in her hand, at the woman for whom he had betrayed a friend and sold his honor. She was on her knees, screaming, without words, without resonance, without strength. Nothing. Kyung-soo looked at Hain. There was something new in his eyes, not fear, hatred, pure and bright as a flame. He turned, jumped off the scaffold, ran, away, through the crowd, through the guards, away from the square. 950 horsepower invested in his legs. He ran so fast that stones crumbled beneath his feet. Hain watched him go, didn't move. He didn't stop him. Let him run. Let him run to the 5th Chrono clan of Hwan. Let him sell them the guard's secrets. Let him receive a new body through the ritual of the reforged flesh. Let him return with 2,400 HP and a face that Hain won't recognize at first glance. Let him. Hain is in no hurry. He had 1,000 years. Kyung-soo does not. The square was silent. After Hain's words, a silence fell that was louder than any scream. 10,000 people on their knees. Yuri on her knees before the scaffold, her wrist empty, a hairpin clutched in her pale fingers. Chol-soo with an axe on the scaffold, the archmage unconscious on the balcony, the king with an empty hand and shards of his scepter at his feet. The Kronar hat standing. Everything froze, not stasis, shock. Then one of the elders stepped forward, the second from the left, the one whose fingers clenched when Hain first emerged from stasis 100 years ago, 10 seconds ago in real time. He stepped toward the balcony railing, and his white mask turned toward the square, toward Hain. He spoke, and his voice was as smooth as the surface of a lake at dawn. He called Hain an anomaly, a threat to the flow. The sentence stands. He gave the order to kill. The guards lay dead. The knights lay dead. The pressure of them hand kept them pinned to the stones. But the elder was not addressing them. He was addressing the square, the principle, the law. The word of the Chronarch had been law for 1,000 years. It remained law now, even if there was no one left to enforce it. Hain looked at the elder for a long time, across the entire square. Then he did what no one expected. He released the pressure, all at once, as if he'd lifted his hand from the surface of the water. 10,000 people sighed simultaneously. The guards rose to their feet. The knights stood up. The stones of the square stopped creaking. People were breathing, looking around, getting to their feet. Hain stood on the scaffold in a torn shirt. No pressure, no aura, no display of power. Just a man. He did it on purpose. The pressure had proven his strength. Now he needed something else. He spoke again, steadily, calmly, in the same voice the entire square had heard. He asked the square if it knew that the altar of verification had been destroyed. Silence. No one knew. The altar stood in the central temple. The temple had been closed during the execution. The priests were inside. The crowd was here. Hain continued. The altar is destroyed.
The stone crumbled to dust. The system that branded every resident of Chongryon no longer exists. From this day forward, the brand on every person's wrist will not be renewed. The numbers will remain, but they are dead, frozen forever. A murmur swept across the square like wind through a wheat field. 10,000 people grabbed their wrists. They looked at the brands. The numbers were still glowing. For now. But the renewal used to take place once a year through the altar. Without the altar, the numbers would become yesterday's, the day before yesterday's, last year's, last generation's. A lie. Hain said that the Chronarchate controlled them through the numbers, through fear, through a hierarchy etched into their skin. He destroyed the instrument of control. Not for himself, for them. The elder on the balcony did not move. The mask looked at Hain. Behind the mask was a face that Hain could not see, but he saw the hands. The hands were clenching the railing. The knuckles had turned white. The second elder lost his composure. Hain continued. He turned to Yuri. She was still kneeling. The scream had ended. Only emptiness remained. Her eyes were glassy, a hairpin in her hand. He said she was free, that her resonance was gone forever, that she now knew how a zero felt, that she could stand up and leave. No one would stop her. Yuri raised her head. Slowly. She looked at him. And in her eyes, Hain saw what he had expected. Not remorse, not a plea. Hatred. Pure. Concentrated. The same as Gyeonsu's, but colder. Yuri wasn't burning. Yuri was calculating. Even now, even on her knees, even with an empty wrist, she was weighing her options. Hain was almost in awe. She stood up. Her legs were shaking. Without resonance, her body was weakening. 1200HR had sustained her physical form for years. Without them, she was a fragile 21-year-old woman. She straightened up, smoothed her hair, put the hairpin back in. The movement was precise, familiar, a ritual. She wore the dragonfly to every ball, to every execution, to every death. She would continue to wear it, because Yuri doesn't give up. Hain knew that. That's why he didn't kill her. A dead Yuri would have been the end of the story. A living Yuri with zero resonance and hatred in her eyes was the beginning. She turned and walked away. Through the crowd, people parted, not out of respect, out of disgust. An empty wrist. Zero. In Chonryon, they shunned Zero as if it were contagious. Hain turned toward the balcony. 7 masks, 7 chairs. 6 elders stood motionless. The second had already stepped back from the railing. His hands were hidden in white sleeves. Hain counted the masks. 6, not 7. One was missing. The first. The first elder, Baek Muryeon. His chair was empty. Hain knew where he was. In the temple's dungeons. By the wall on the 23rd level, where the Nameless One had slept. Baek Muryeon sensed what was happening, and he wasn't sitting on the balcony because the balcony no longer mattered. The public execution had failed. The instrument of control was destroyed. The third prince was alive, and his power lay beyond the bounds of this dimension. Baek Muryeon was already preparing his response. Not a sword. Not an army. Something worse. Hain descended from the scaffold. The steps creaked beneath his feet. Cholsu followed behind him, an axe on his shoulder, blood on his lip. A simple face. Loyal eyes. The square parted. Hain walked through 10,000 people, and every one of them was watching him, at his torn shirt, at his bare wrist with 2 lines, at his face, calm as a stone at the bottom of the sea. He was walking toward the temple. 2 were waiting there, his mother on the 14th level, a priestess in a cell without a crystal. He had taken 20 steps when he felt it. A subtle shift, not in the air, in the stream. Something had changed, somewhere deep down, in the foundation, in the very structure of the prison. Hain stopped. He looked up. The sky was blue, peaceful, ordinary. But at a single point directly above the square, the light was slightly different, slightly less bright, slightly denser, as if it were glass, as if the sky were made of glass and a microcrack had appeared in that spot. No one noticed. 10,000 people were looking down, at him, at the square, at the shards of the scepter. No one was looking up, except for the traitor. He stood and looked at the crack in the sky, and inside himself, at the spot where the shard from the hall without walls lay. Something responded, quietly, like an echo, like a voice through a wall. Something very large and very ancient knew that the castle had awakened. The temple greeted him with silence, not the dead silence of stasis, alive, alert, the silence of a beast lying in wait. Hain walked through the corridors and the walls pulsed. The current inside them moved faster than usual. Something was disturbing the system.
Something below! Cholsu followed him, an axe on his shoulder. Heavy footsteps. He asked no questions. The executioner was accustomed to doing his work in silence, and now his work was to follow the man who was to die by his hand. Hain descended, level by level, the first, the fifth, 10th. Temple priests crossed their path. They looked at the condemned man's torn shirt and the brand with 2 lines and pressed themselves against the walls. No one tried to stop them. 14th level, a corridor, a door. Hain stopped in front of it. The seals he had broken in stasis were still in place. Stasis worked like this. He could interact with objects, but when time returned, the objects returned to their original state. The Kroner hat seals had been restored. 3 of them. Hain touched the first one. It burst like a soap bubble. The second. The third. The door opened. A room. 3 steps long, 2 wide. A woman by the wall, thin. Dark hair streaked with gray. Her eyes were open. She was staring at the wall. Just like 1,000 years ago when he found her in stasis, only now she was alive. Time had passed. She stood there staring at the wall because she had been standing that way for 19 years. 19 years in a 3x2 cell. Her body remembered the posture. Her muscles remembered the stillness. She didn't turn when the door opened. Hain stepped inside. 1 step. The cell was small. 1 step and he was standing next to her. He could touch her. For the first time in 1,000 years, he could touch a living person. He reached out. His fingers touched her shoulder. Delicate, bony, real. She flinched, turned her head, slowly, as if her head weighed a ton. Her eyes found his face. Dark eyes. His eyes. He had inherited them just as he had inherited her hands. She looked and did not recognize him. She remembered the baby. A month old, maybe 2. They took him away early. She hadn't seen him grow up, hadn't seen him become a boy, a young man, a man. She didn't know his face, but she knew his eyes. Her own eyes in a stranger's face. Her lips moved. She asked without a voice, with her lips alone. He answered, quietly. He said she was his mother, that he had come, that the door would never close again. Jung Hae-won, 6,200 XP. The King's Wife, a prisoner of Kronar Hat.
The mother of the prince with zero resonance. She didn't cry. 19 years in the dark had robbed her of her tears. She just stood there and looked at him through her own eyes in his face. Then her knees buckled. Her body wouldn't hold her. 19 years without movement, without food except prison gruel, without light except a dim lamp. Hain caught her, easily. She weighed as much as a child. He carried her out of the cell. Cholsu stood in the corridor. He saw the woman in Hain's arms. He saw the cell behind him, the chronarch seals on the door. His face remained unchanged. The executioner saw things. The executioner knew things. He knew that secrets were kept in the temple's dungeons. He didn't know that among those secrets were living people. Hain went down. Cholsu followed him, Haewon in his arms. 3 more levels down, the cell where Hagionok's crystal had stood. The crystal was gone. Shards lay on the floor. They hadn't reformed into seals because Hain had destroyed not the lock but the container itself. The difference between breaking a door and breaking a wall. A door can be repaired. A wall cannot. Hagionok lay on the floor among the shards, old, small,
Curled up like a child. She was breathing. Hain laid his mother on the floor and approached the priestess. She opened her eyes. Cloudy, whitish. Eyes that had seen the world before the flood. 400 years in a crystal. Her body remembered its confinement. Her muscles had atrophied. Her bones had grown brittle. But her eyes were alive. She looked at Hain and smiled. The toothless smile of an old woman who had lived through an era. She whispered. She said she had been waiting, that she knew he would come, that the stones had told her. The stones remembered his footsteps. The 7 artifacts of the Silent Age that he had left around her crystal lay nearby. She held one of them in her hand, a shard of a world that no longer existed, a shard of home. Hain helped her sit down. She was lighter than his mother, a feather from the past. He asked if she could walk. She laughed, quietly, hoarsely. She hadn't walked in 400 years, but she would try, because the boy who smelled of the Silent Age had come for her, and that meant it was time. Hain carried 2, his mother in his right arm, the priestess on his left. Cholsu walked ahead. His axe cleared the path.
Not from people, from seals. The doors to the dungeons were sealed by Kronerhat. Cholsu struck with his axe and the seals shattered. Not by the executioner's strength. 600 HP couldn't break Kronerhat's seal. But Hain followed behind him, and his presence weakened the seals to the consistency of paper. Cholsu struck the paper and didn't know why the doors gave way so easily. They opened, level after level. On the 5th level, Hain sensed movement, not footsteps, the flow. Someone was manipulating the flow within the temple walls, redirecting it, concentrating it. On the 3rd level, the air grew thick. On the 1st, the walls glowed. The flow was being driven toward the exit, toward them. Hain stepped out of the temple onto the steps. The square in front of the temple was empty. The crowd had dispersed. Guards had cordoned off the perimeter. A man stood on the temple steps, alone, unmasked. An old man, very old, a face like parchment, clear eyes, white robes, long fingers. Hain recognized the fingers. He had seen them through the diary's memories. The first elder, Bek Murion. He stood on the steps of the temple he had guarded for 1,000 years and looked at the man he had sentenced to death 19 years ago. In his arms were 2 women. One of them was the prisoner whom Bek Murion had personally sent to the cell. The other was the priestess whom he had personally sealed in crystal. Bek Murion looked at Hain. His face showed neither fear nor anger, only interest. The pure, cold interest of a scientist observing an experiment that had spiraled out of control. He said the castle was never meant to awaken, that they had calculated everything,
that the execution was a shadow erasure ritual, that Hain's soul was to be sacrificed to fortify the prison, that the poison was part of the ritual, that the accusations were a cover-up, that everything, from the first day to the last, had been planned. Hain listened. He knew all of this. The diary had told him 600 years ago. Baek Muryeon continued. He said that Yuri and Gyeongsu were tools. The Kronarhat found Yuri through the third clan, suggested the idea of the absorption to her, pushed Gyeongsu into her bed. He orchestrated the betrayal so it would look personal.
So the political ritual would look like the execution of a traitor. Hain lowered the mother and the priestess onto the steps, carefully. Chol-su stood before them. Hain straightened up and looked at Baek Muryeon. The first elder stood 20 paces away. Between them were the temple steps, stone, air, and 1,000 years. Hain asked one thing. Why hadn't they killed him in his cradle? Baek Muryeon answered, because a shard cannot be destroyed until it is activated. A dormant shard is invulnerable. They had to awaken him and then perform the ritual. For 19 years, they had cultivated the lock to insert it into the door and turn it. Hain nodded. He understood. He had always been the key, not a person, the key. They had raised him as a tool, gave him a name, gave him a title, gave him a bride, gave him a friend, gave him life, so that at the right moment they could take it all away and use the pain as fuel for the ritual. Baek Muryeon raised his hand. The flow around the temple howled. The walls glowed brighter. The earth shook. The flow struck. Not a spell, not a technique. The flow of eternity itself, directed by the will of the first elder.
The river of time surged at Hain like a tsunami at a grain of sand. The air around him aged 100 years in a second. The stones of the steps crumbled to dust. The trees in the temple garden turned black and crumbled to dust. A bird flying over the temple turned into a skeleton, and the skeleton into dust, and the dust into nothingness. 100 years in a second for everything that came under its blow, except for Hain. The stream flowed around him, like water flows around a hole, like a river flows around a stone that does not exist for it. Time did not see Hain. It could not touch him. It could not age him. It could not kill him. Baek Muryeon watched. His face did not change. He knew. He knew the stream would not work. He had tested it. Hain stood in the crater of destruction. Around him, a circle of scorched earth. Beyond the circle, the world went on. The guard at the perimeter staggered from the shock wave, but held his ground. Chol-su shielded the two women on the steps with his body, his axe vibrating in his hands. Hagyeonok raised her hand, and a wall rose between her and the stream. Thin, transparent, like glass. Magic of the Silent Age. Even after 400 years in the crystal, the priestess remembered. Muryeon turned his head toward her. His eyes narrowed. He recognized the technique. He knew what it was. He knew where it came from. He waved his hand, and 4 pillars rose from the ground around the temple. Stone, black, 4 anchors, an emergency system. They stood dug into the ground around the temple in case the prison's foundation failed. 4 pillars, each carrying the resonance of one of the elders. 40,000 HP, 38,000 0 HP, 42,000 HP, 39,000 HP. 4 pillars, about 160,000 HP of total power. Numbers that would stop the heart of anyone in Chongryon.
Numbers that proved the Chronorkit was something more than 7 old men in masks. They were guardians, jailers, and their power was commensurate with the prison. The pillars lit up. A stream from them struck Hyena from 4 sides, simultaneously. Not time, not aging, something else. An anchor. 4 anchors were trying to latch onto Hain and tie him to the stream, to make him part of the system, to give him an anchor he'd never had, by force. If the stream couldn't see him, he had to make it see. Anchor him. Anchor him.
Turn him from a whole into a part of the fabric, and then erase him.
Cain felt 4 threads pulling toward his chest, toward the spot where the shard from the hall without walls lay. The threads were hot, alive. They were searching for a point of attachment, searching for an anchor, searching for anything they could grab onto. They found the shard and pulled away, like fingers from a fire. The shard was part of the one who sat behind the wall on the 23rd level, the one for whom the prison was built. The anchors could not attach themselves to a fragment of the prisoner. It was like trying to chain a door to a lock that it was meant to lock itself. A contradiction. A paradox. The threads snapped. The pillars cracked. 4 stone anchors with a combined power of 160,000 horsepower shattered like clay pots. Shards of stone rained down on the square in front of the temple. Bek-Muran retreated, 1 step back, the first step back in 1,000 years of his life. Hain took a step forward. The steps beneath his feet were intact. The stream had not touched the stone upon which he stood. A hole in the river. He was walking toward Muran, step by step. 20 steps. Muran raised both hands.
6 more strands of the current burst from the temple walls, thinner, faster. Not anchors, blades. The current compressed into the form of a blade. Time sharpened into a cutting edge. A single such blade could cleave a mountain. 6 sliced through the air around Hain. He did not dodge. The blades passed through him, as if through steam. The stream could not touch him, not as a tsunami, not as an anchor, not as a blade. Hain was outside the stream, outside of time, outside the system that Muran had guarded for 1,000 years. 12 steps. 10. 8. Muran did something he had never done before. He took off his mask. Not the white one. He was without the white mask. He took off the other one. A face beneath a face. A layer of illusion that all the elders wore over their true appearance. Beneath the illusion was a face. Old. Ancient. Not human. Not quite. The features were too perfect. The eyes too deep. The skin too smooth for a creature over 1,000 years old. A descendant of the architects. Not a metaphor. Literally. The blood of those who built the prison flowed through his veins. Muran spoke. His voice had changed. It had grown deeper, older. He said that Hain didn't understand what he was doing, that the prison wasn't a punishment, that what lay beyond the wall wasn't a victim, it was a monster. It had been devouring reality before the architects stopped it. It had been turning time into chaos. It erased cause and effect. A world without the flow was not free. It was madness. Hain stopped. 6 steps. He looked at Muran, at his true face, at the eyes that had witnessed the prison's birth. He asked, "If what's behind the wall is a monster, then so is he. A fragment of the monster, a partial reincarnation. He is a monster too." Muran answered instantly, "Yes." Hain nodded. He had expected that answer. He had waited 1,000 years for it. He took another step, raised his hand, touched Muran's chest. With a single finger, a light touch. Anchor magic, not destruction, rewriting. Hain did not erase Muran's anchor. He altered its parameters. The Elder's connection to the flow remained, but the direction had changed. Muran was no longer the jailer. He had become the prisoner.
The flow he had controlled for 1,000 years had begun to control him. His body froze. Not stasis. Anchor binding. The flow coursed through him and prevented him from moving. Time passed for him, but his body would not obey. Murian's eyes were open. They were filled with terror, real, genuine, the terror of a being that, for the first time in 1,000 years, had lost control. Hain leaned toward him, quietly, just for him. He said he wouldn't kill him, that Murian would stand there until Hain decided what to do with the prison, until he learned the whole truth, until he spoke with the one behind the wall. And then Hain would return, and Murian would tell him everything. Everything he knows, everything he remembers, everything he's been hiding. Hain stepped back. Murian stood on the temple steps, motionless, eyes wide open, horror behind his inhuman features. The first jailer became the first prisoner. So Meyer stood in the doorway of her room, holding a flower, white, delicate, nameless. It had appeared on her table while the world stood still for that very second that lasted 1,000 years. She didn't know that. She only knew that the flower smelled of something that didn't exist in this world. Not lavender, not a rose, not jasmine. Something more ancient.
Something that made you want to cry for no reason. She cried on the scaffold, the only one of them all. 16 years old, 200 hours, Yuri's younger sister. She stood in the crowd, tears streaming down her cheeks as the executioner raised his axe. She didn't know about the conspiracy. She didn't know about the absorption. She didn't know that her sister had spent 2 years preparing the death of the man Meyer considered her future brother. She just cried because a man was dying, because it was wrong. Now she stood in the doorway of the room and looked at the flower. The square buzzed with rumors. The third prince is alive. His resonance extends beyond the dimension. Yuri has lost her power. The altar is destroyed. The world was changing. In a single second, the world was changing faster than it had in the previous 3 centuries. Meyer took the flower and left the room. She was walking toward the temple. She didn't know why. The flower was pulling her, not with magic, not by force, with its scent, a scent that said someone was thinking of her. Someone, in the silence that had lasted 1,000 years, had left her a gift, and she wanted to find that someone. Hain was standing on the temple steps. His mother sat beside him. Ha-Gyunuk lay on his cloak. He had given the priestess the suicide bomber's torn shirt as a blanket and remained naked from the waist down. Chol-Su stood with an axe. The motionless Murian stood behind them. Guards had cordoned off the temple but did not approach. The 6 elders were conferring on the palace balcony. The city was buzzing. Rumors were spreading. The truth was becoming entangled with fabrications. Some said the third prince had killed Kronerkot. Others said he was a demon. Others said he was a god. Hain sat on the steps and waited. He knew what would happen next. 1,000 years of planning. Every move calculated. Every reaction had been anticipated. Yuri would flee. Gyeonsu would flee. Kronerkot would retreat and regroup. Murian was neutralized, but the other 6 were still at large, and they would start raising the stakes. The first response would come in hours, not days, hours. Kronerkot didn't know how to wait when control was slipping away. Meyer appeared 20 minutes later, a small figure, dark hair, a white flower in her hands. She walked through the cordon and the guards let her pass. 200 horsepower. So Yuri's younger sister, an aristocrat of the 3rd clan. No threat. She climbed the steps. She saw Hain. She saw the woman beside him, the old woman on his cloak, the executioner with the axe, and the frozen figure of Murian with his eyes open. She stopped. She looked at Hain. He looked at her.
He knew that face. He had seen it for 1,000 years. In the square, among 10,000 faces, only one was crying. Hers. She held out a flower. Silently. She simply held it out. Hain took it. Their fingers touched, and Myers shuddered. His skin was cold. Not like ice, like a stone at the bottom of the sea. 1,000 years of silence had left its mark. She asked, quietly. He was still human. The question Hain had been waiting for 1,000 years. The question asked by the only one who had the right to ask it. He didn't answer, because he didn't know. Instead of answering, he asked her to sit down. She sat on the steps next to his mother. Hain looked at the girl. Meyer looked at the woman. Two strangers on the steps of a temple in a world that was changing faster than they could comprehend. Ha-gyeon-ok opened her eyes. She looked at Meyer. She smiled. She said the girl smelled of tears. That's good. Tears meant the world was still worth crying over. Hain stood up. He had to act. 24 hours. That was how much time he had before he could enter stasis again. 24 hours of vulnerability. 24 hours during which the Kroner hat could strike. He turned to Cholsu. He asked him to guard the three, his mother, the priestess, the girl. Cholsu nodded without a word. Axe on his shoulder. He stood between the steps and the world. 600 horsepower. A pitifully small amount for what might come, but he stood his ground. Hain walked toward the palace, alone, through the streets of the capital. People watched. A half-naked man with 2 marks on his wrist, rope scars, scars from poison. A body that looked 30 but moved like something much older. Not slowly, precisely. Every step measured. Every movement economical. Not a single superfluous gesture. 1,000 years of training had burned everything unnecessary out of his body. He entered the palace. The guards parted. Not on command, out of instinct. He walked through the throne room, past the throne on which no one sat. The king father was gone, had fled or gone into hiding.
The scepter was broken. The throne was empty. Hain did not sit on it. He had no interest in the throne. He walked on. Into the council chamber, a long table, 12 chairs, one for each Chrono clan, all empty. The clan leaders had fled. News of what had happened in the square and at the temple had spread instantly. The altar was destroyed. Moran froze. The anchors were shattered. The aristocracy of Chongryon went into hiding. Hain sat down in the third clan's chair, Yuri's chair, her father's chair. He placed his hands on the armrests. Under his right palm, he felt the anchor. The third Chrono clan's artifact anchor was built into the chair, hidden within the wood and metal. Each clan kept its anchor in its own way. The third chose the most obvious place, the chair of the clan head. Hain squeezed the armrest. The anchor inside snapped, quietly, like a twig snapping. At that moment, every member of the third Chrono clan throughout Chonryon felt their resonance drop to 2. The genetic link to the stream weakened. The numbers on the brands twitched and faded. Yuri was already a 0, but her father, her brothers, her cousins, each of them lost half their power in an instant. And each of them knew what that meant. The anchor was destroyed. The third clan was dead as a political force. Hain stood up. 11 chairs, 11 anchors. Each of them was a fragment of the prison. Each supported the bars. To destroy them all meant to weaken the prison, to allow what lay beyond the wall to get closer to freedom. Hain remembered Moran's words. A monster, a devourer of reality. He didn't know whether to believe it. A jailer will always call a prisoner a monster. It justifies the prison. But what if it's true? What if behind the wall there really is something that devours time? And Hain is a fragment of it. And every anchor destroyed makes the bars thinner. The Nameless One spoke.
For the first time in real time, a quiet voice on the edge of consciousness. He said that Hain knew the answer, that he had felt it in the hall without walls when he touched the shard, that the answer was within him. It always had been. Hain closed his eyes, opened them, rose from his chair. 11 anchors. He wouldn't break them all, not yet. First, he would speak with the priestess. She remembers the world before the prison. She knows whether there was a monster there or freedom.
And only after that would he decide. Hagenok spoke, and her voice was like the creaking of old wood. They sat on the steps of the temple, Meyer beside her, Hyunwon beside her, Chol-su behind her. Night had fallen on the capital, and the torches burned dimly. The priestess spoke of the world before the flood. She said that the truth lies in the middle. The creature behind the wall was neither a monster nor a victim. It was the world. Literally. Before the architects built the prison, there was no difference between the creature and reality. Time was its breath. Space was its body. Life was its dreams. It did not devour reality. It was reality. The architects did not imprison a monster. They imprisoned the universe. They cut off a piece of it. They called it the stream, linear time, order. And on that piece, they built their world. Chunryeon, Hwaguk, all the empires, all of civilization, everything that existed stood upon a fragment of the imprisoned god. And every living person with a brand on their wrist paid a tax with their life so that the prison would not collapse. Hain listened. The flower of the silent age lay on the steps between them, its scent mingling with the night air. He asked what would happen if the prison fell. Hagyonok fell silent for a long time. Then she answered. She didn't know. 400 years ago, when Kronerhat sealed her in crystal, she had for the answer to that question. She didn't find it. Perhaps the world would return to what it was before the flow. Time would become an ocean. Cause and effect would cease to be mandatory. People would lose their anchors, every single one of them. Resonance would disappear as a category. Maybe it will be freedom. Maybe chaos. Maybe the end. She doesn't know. Mir listened. Her eyes were wide open. 200 hours, 16 years old. She didn't understand half of what the priestess was saying, but she understood the main point. The world stood upon a prison, and the man sitting next to her could destroy that prison. She looked at Hain, at his face in the light of the torches. Calm, steady, a stone at the bottom of the sea. She asked what he would choose. Hain looked at her, at the face of a 16-year-old girl who had cried while 10,000 people remained silent.
He replied that first he would finish what he had started. Then he would choose. First, Kronerhat. Then the prison. Order was important. A noise from the eastern side of the city interrupted their conversation. A rumble, low, growing. The ground shook. Chol-su raised his axe. Hain stood up. He could feel it. The flow was changing. Someone was pulling it, redirecting it. The 6 remaining elders were acting. The sealed were coming from the eastern gates of the capital. Kronerhat had released the sealed. Beings from the past. Not humans, not animals, shadows of what existed before the flow. Kronerhat had captured them centuries ago and sealed them away as a weapon of last resort. Beings without anchors, without marks, without resonance. They moved outside the flow, just like Hain. But unlike Hain, they were hungry. 400 years in seals, 400 years without food, and their food was time. 3 sealed ones, each the size of a house, formless, fluid, shadows that shifted shape with every step. Where they walked, stone aged and crumbled.
Trees turned black. Water evaporated. They were heading toward the temple, toward Hain. The Kroner hat had sent them.
Hain stood up. Her old body trembled, but her eyes burned. She recognized the sealed ones. She remembered them. They were part of the world before the flood. Fragments of the same reality as the creature behind the wall. Tiny fragments, but large enough to destroy a city. Hain descended the steps. He stepped out onto the square in front of the temple. 3 shadows moved down the street. Destruction followed in their wake. Houses crumbled. People fled. Screams. Chaos. The capital, which had survived 3 centuries without war, was crumbling in a matter of minutes. Hain raised his hand. Anchor magic. He couldn't destroy the sealed ones. They were outside the flow, just like him. But he could give them an anchor, bind them to the flow, make them part of the system, and then the system would devour them on its own. Time would crash down upon the beings that existed outside of it and wipe out in a second what had lived for millennia. The first sealed one reached the square, a shadow the size of a house, formless, hungry. It reached out toward Hain, and he stepped toward it. His hand entered that shadow. Cold, absolute, even for him, even for one whom time had not touched. These beings were of the same fabric as he, from the same source. To touch them was to touch himself, that part of himself that existed before human birth, before the shard, before the name. He wove in the anchor, thin, precise. A thread of the flow entered the shadow, and the shadow howled, a sound that shattered the windows in the nearest houses. The flow surged into the creature that had existed for millennia without it. Time crashed down. The shadow aged, shrank, crumbled. Within 3 seconds, only ashes remained of the first sealed one. Hain turned to the second one. Same technique, same result. Anchor, flow, destruction. The third one tried to run, turned around, ran back down the street. Hain snapped his fingers. Not stasis. He couldn't enter stasis for another 20 hours. He directed anchor magic from a distance. A thread of the flow shot across the street. It caught up to the shadow. It pierced him. The third sealed one crumbled as he ran. Ashes settled on the pavement. The square in front of the temple looked like a scene after a fire. Collapsed houses, blackened trees, cracks in the stone. But the sealed ones were no more. Hain stood amid the destruction and looked east, at the palace, at the balcony of the Ronarchat. The 6 elders had unleashed their weapon of last resort, and it had lasted less than a minute. He could feel their panic. The stream trembled. 6 points in the fabric of the world pulsed with alarm. They were beginning to understand. Muron was right about one thing. The castle had awakened, and the prison was beginning to crack. But not because Hain was breaking it, but because Hain existed. Every second of his existence in real time weakened the bars. His presence was a negation of the system, a hole in the fabric that expanded simply because it breathed. The crack in the sky he had seen before had grown larger. Now everyone could see it. A thin line in the blue sky, like a scratch on glass. And something was moving behind the glass. Something was watching. Hain stood on the temple steps and wept. She recognized that movement beyond the crack. She remembered it. The world. The real world. The one that existed before the prison. It was waking up. Morning, red silk square, the same stones, the same scaffold, the same air that 20 hours ago smelled of execution and now smelled of the ashes of the sealed and of fear. Hain stood on the scaffold, the same one where he had knelt when the world still considered him the 80. He had chosen this place deliberately. Symmetry, completion, a circle that must close before a new one begins. The square was full. Not 10,000, more. The news had spread overnight. People flocked from all corners of the capital, from the suburbs, from the nearest towns. Those who could run, ran. Those who couldn't, stood and waited. Everyone wanted to see.
On the steps of the temple across from the square stood a frozen Bakhmutian, the first jailer who became the first prisoner. His eyes were open. He saw everything. He couldn't move. He couldn't speak. He could only watch. Hain had brought him here at night, carried him like a statue, placed him so the square could see, so that every person in Chongyun could see that the Kroner hat could be stopped, that the masks could be removed, that the jailers were mortal. The 6 remaining elders stood on the palace balcony, 6 white masks, 6 white robes. They did not flee. There was nowhere to run. The Kroner hat had existed for 1,000 years. They were woven into the fabric of the world. Their power was the flow, and the flow was everywhere. To flee from the flow meant to flee from reality. They stood and waited and prepared their response. Hain sensed it. The flow trembled beneath their hands. They were drawing something from the depths, from the foundation, from that level where the wall separated the world from the imprisoned. They were preparing a last resort. Yuri stood in the crowd. Hain knew. He felt her absence in the flow, the hole he himself had created. Zero resonance, an empty wrist. She had come to watch. She stood among the common folk with a resonance of 0.1 XP, and for the first time in her life was one of them, below them. At least they had numbers. She had nothing, but she had come, because Yuri doesn't give up. Hain spoke. His voice was steady. No shouting, no magic. 1,000 years of silence had given him a voice that the entire square could hear. He told the truth, the whole truth, about the stream, about the prison, about the Kronerkate, about how resonance is not a gift, but a tax, that every person in Chongryon pays with their life to keep the bars standing, that the brand on the wrist is not a measure of strength, but a measure of how much time a person gives to the prison with every breath. The square was silent. 20,000 people and silence. He continued. He spoke of his mother, of the 3x2 cell, of 19 years, about the woman whom the Kroner hat buried alive for asking questions. Haewon stood on the temple steps, alive, thin, with her son's eyes. People looked at her, at the queen they had believed dead for 19 years. He spoke of Yuri, of the third clan's conspiracy, of the 20-year plan, of how Kroner hat had orchestrated the betrayal, used Yuri as a tool, used Gyeongsu as a tool, used love as a tool. He spoke of himself, of the zero resonance at birth, of the swapped brand, of how he was raised as the key to the ritual, a tool in human form, a stepping stone to prison. The square listened. 20,000 faces, 20,000 pairs of eyes, 20,000 brands on wrists that suddenly began to feel not like a mark of honor, but like a collar. The Kroner hat on the balcony did not move. 6 masks, 6 jailers. They listened as their millennia-old lie crumbled before the eyes of the entire city. And they finished their preparations. The stream shuddered. It didn't flinch. It shuddered. The ground gave way beneath their feet. Cracks appeared in the walls of the houses. The sky darkened. Not the clouds. The light itself grew dimmer. The 6 elders raised their hands simultaneously, and the stream howled. They were sacrificing one of their own, the 5th elder. His body on the balcony trembled and began to disintegrate. Not into dust, into light. His resonance, his life, his memory, his existence were turning into energy. 40,000 HP of a single elder poured into the ritual. The other 5 directed the flow of energy downward, through the palace, through the earth, into the foundation, to the wall on the 23rd level. They were opening a gate, not to the Silent Age, to what lay beyond the wall. They summoned the devourer of the flow, not the whole, a fragment, a tentacle, a drop from the ocean, enough to destroy the traitor. Because the creature beyond the wall devoured time, and the traitor stood outside of time. To the devourer, he was not a threat, but food,
A shard of the whole. A piece that had escaped and needed to be returned. The sky above the square burst open. The crack that had been a scratch became a fissure. Light poured through the fissure. Not white, not black. Light that did not exist in the spectrum of linear time. The light of the silent age. And in that light, an eye appeared. Huge, larger than the sun. Not human, not animal, not divine. The eye of a being that was the universe before the universe was locked away. It looked out over the square, at the 20,000 people who lived on its body like parasites on a whale's back, at the chronarchat that had kept it in chains for 1,000 years, at the traitor. The eye found the traitor and blinked, with recognition, like one who has long since lost his own hand and sees it again. Pressure crashed down on the square. Not Hain's pressure, something else, something ancient, something absolute. People were losing consciousness, by the dozens, by the hundreds. The guards were falling. Aristocrats with resonances in the thousands clutched their throats. Archmage Cho Do-hyun, who had barely regained consciousness after his first faint, lost consciousness again, and blood began to flow from his nose. Only 4 remained standing. Hain, Ha-gyeonok, who knew this being. Meyer, who stood next to Hain and whose presence created a zone of silence. And Yuri. Yuri stood there, with 0 resonance, without a connection to the stream. The pressure flowed through the stream, and she was cut off from it. Irony. Hain's punishment had saved her life. The eye looked at Hain, and Hain looked at the eye, at himself, at what he was before he became human, at the ocean from which he was a drop. He felt the pull, the call, to return, to dissolve, to become whole, to cease being a fragment and become everything. The Nameless One screamed inside him. For the first time in 1,000 years, he screamed. He didn't speak. He didn't argue. He screamed. He screamed that it was a trap, that this was exactly what the chronarch wanted, to drive the fragment away from the whole, to force the traitor to dissolve, to return the drop to the ocean. And then the lock would be gone, and the prison would stand. Because the castle was not a key to the door, but a crack in the wall. A living crack. To remove the crack meant to patch up the wall. Hain stopped. His eye waited. The pull grew stronger. Every cell in his body yearned for the rift in the sky. To return, to become whole, to cease being alone. 1,000 years of loneliness, and now the end. Here is the answer, to dissolve. Hain closed his eyes, opened them, looked down, at the temple steps, at his mother, who was looking up at him with dark eyes, at Meyer, who was holding a white flower and crying, at Cholsu, who stood with an axe and understood nothing but stood there, at Ha-gyeonok, who was smiling because she knew what he would choose. He looked at the eye, at himself, at the ocean. He spoke softly, but the square heard him. He said no, he would not return. He would not dissolve. He would not become whole. He is a shard. He is a crack. He is a hole in the prison wall, and he would remain hers, because the prison must fall. But not today, not like this, not at the cost of his life, which he had lived for 1,000 years in silence. He raised his hand. Anchor magic. Not at the creature, at the rift. He wove the anchor into the edges of the crack. He didn't close it. He didn't patch it. He stabilized it. The crack remained, the eye remained, but the pressure subsided. People began to breathe. The rift froze. Like a window, an open window between the prison and what lay beyond it. The chronarchat on the balcony froze. 5 of them. They had sacrificed one for the ritual. 5 old men in white masks who had just sacrificed their comrade and received nothing in return. Hain turned to them, across the entire square.
He said this was their last weapon. The sealed ones are destroyed. Muron is captured. The fifth elder is dead. The gates are open but didn't work. They have nothing left. He's coming for them, just as he promised. The 5 masks didn't move, but Hain saw it. One of the masks, the third from the left, it flinched. A millimeter. A nod that shouldn't have been there. A fear that shouldn't have existed. Hain stepped down from the scaffold. The square parted. People were coming to their senses. They got to their feet. They looked at him, at the rift in the sky, at the eye that was still watching from behind the glass, at the world that in a single day had ceased to be what it had been for 1,000 years. Meyer caught up with him at the steps. She grabbed his hand. Her fingers were warm, alive. He turned around. She said he had answered her question. He was still human. Hain looked at her, at the white flower in her hair. She had pinned it there instead of a hairpin. A flower from the Silent Age in the hair of a 16-year-old girl from a world built on a prison. He said it wasn't over yet, that Yuri had left and would return, that Gyeongsu had fled and would return, that the 5 elders were alive and would fight, that the eye in the sky was open and would not close, that his mother was weak and needed time, that the priestess was old and needed protection, that the 12 clans were frightened but not broken, that the Hwaguk Empire had called up the fleet but has not abandoned its plans, that somewhere in the dungeons of the 5th clan, Hwang Gyeongsu is already trading the guard's secrets for a new body and new power, that war lies ahead, not a battle, a war. He turned toward the temple, toward the frozen Murion on the steps, toward his mother, toward the priestess, toward Cholsu with his axe. He said 24 hours had passed. He could enter stasis again, but not now. Now he is here, in this world, in this time, among living people he could touch. For the first time in 1,000 years, he was not alone, and that was worth every day of vulnerability. Above the square, in the rift in the sky, an eye blinked. Slowly. Recognition gave way to something else. Patience. He had waited 1,000 years. He would wait a little longer. And in the temple's dungeons on the 23rd level, behind a wall that even Hain could not break through, something very large stirred. For the first time in an era, the wall trembled. A crack thinner than a hair ran across its surface. The first in the prison's entire history.